Hello, Year Sevens. This is the third lesson of the Who Rules unit. So to get us started, let's have a think about the Magna Carta. So what you were looking at in the previous lesson. So just have a quick think about how the Magna Carta changed the power of the king and potentially what are some long-term significant consequences of the Magna Carta. So what you learned in last lesson about King John and the Magna Carta directly leads us into our lesson for today. We're looking at where Parliament came from. So we're going to look at King Henry III, and we're going to look at how his mistakes essentially led to the creation of Parliament. So we'll be looking at a man called Simon de Montfort, and we'll also be looking at how this creation of Parliament has an impact on our lives today. Okay, so we've got two key terms. One is Great Council and the other is Parliament, but we will get into those in more detail a little later on. So we know that kings have always been rich. They've always been very powerful, and they've always relied on powerful landowners for advice. So things about money, so how should we raise taxes, as well as going to war. And often when a king would meet with his advisors, that is what we called a great council. And while the king would consult other people for decisions, the king nearly always got his way. Okay? However, we know that in 1215, this all changed when King John was forced to sign the Magna Carta. From that point on, the king could no longer do whatever he wanted. Okay? So a year after the Magna Carta was signed, King John died, and his 9-year-old son, Henry III, became king. So take a moment and have a think. When Henry becomes king in 1216, when he's 9 years old, do you think he is going to continue to follow the rules of the Magna Carta? And how might this all link to Parliament and the way that Britain is ruled today? So just have a quick think. So we know that Henry became king when he was 9, but as he got older, he started to ignore the advice of his council. If you have a look at the cartoon, I'd like for you to read what each of their different complaints were, and in your book, summarize the complaints of the Great Council. So why exactly were the Great Council unhappy with King Henry III? For example, it seemed like he was spending a lot of money and therefore having to tax people more money. He wasn't taking their advice. He made some militarily bad decisions. He wasn't a very good soldier. And of course, he was giving jobs to his wife's friends and relatives. So he wasn't exactly pleasing and keeping the Great Council happy. So have a read through that cartoon, and in your book, take a few moments to summarize what are those complaints. If you'd like to stretch yourself a bit further, which of those complaints do you think would upset the barons the most? And explain to me why. So by 1258, the barons had had enough. Okay, they decide to meet with Henry III in Oxford, and they forced him to sign a document called the Provisions of Oxford. Very similarly to the Magna Carta, this document gives a lot more power to the barons. So the king cannot make decisions without the Great Council's agreement. The Great Council should choose the king's main advisors, not the king himself. A parliament consisting of 15 members of the Great Council, plus 12 other barons, has to meet at least 3 times a year. So essentially, by signing this, King Henry III has to give more power to this Great Council to those barons. Now, the king's son, named Prince Edward, is furious. He hates that his father was treated this way, was forced to sign this provision, and he swears to get revenge. A few years later, in 1264, Henry gets an army together. He decides he is going to fight the barons. He's very unhappy with having to sign that provisions of Oxford. So you have the king's army versus the baron's army. And the king's army is led by Prince Edward, so Henry III's son. The baron's army is led by a man called Simon de Montfort. Now, the two sides fight on the 14th of May, 1264, and it is the barons who are victorious under the leadership of Simon de Montfort. He takes King Henry and his son, Prince Edward, as prisoner. Then in 1265, Simon de Montfort calls a meeting of the Great Council. Not only does he invite barons and bishops, so people who are very rich, powerful, and influential, but he decides to include 2 ordinary wealthy people from each large town and 2 knights from each county. So why is this important? Well, it's often referred to as the First Parliament, and it's called the First Parliament because it involves ordinary people discussing the running of the country. So no longer was the Great Council just the king, barons, and bishops, but now you are including ordinary wealthy people and knights as well. Okay, so running a little bit more like how we see Parliament today. Then in August of 1265, Prince Edward escapes from prison and he gathers an army to fight Simon de Montfort. And Simon de Montfort is defeated and he is killed. That means that Prince Edward becomes our king. Now there is a link to a video clip which helps to explain this series of events in more detail. So I would suggest that you click on the link and watch the video clip as well. So Prince Edward becomes king in 1272, and he realizes he doesn't want to start another conflict, another war, and he doesn't want to risk fighting with the barons again. So he decides, I need to keep up this idea of Parliament in order to keep the barons happy. This, in turn, makes the barons realize we're actually quite powerful. Again, if the king needs money, Parliament can be the ones to collect that for him. And Parliament can ask the king permission to introduce new laws. So it was in their best interest that they were friendlier with each other and that the king and the Great Council, your barons, would work together. So he keeps the idea of Parliament, so that same type of Parliament set up by Simon de Montfort. And as you can see from our setup of our Parliament here, we have the king, the lords, and the commons. So your king, he decides when Parliament is to meet, and Parliament couldn't stop collecting taxes for the king if they didn't like what he was doing. So they still had to work for the king. As you can see, he is at the top of that triangle pyramid. Then you have your lords. So these were the richest of your barons. These were your bishops, so really rich, influential people, and they met in what's known as the House of Lords. They had the right to attend, and that was then passed from father to son. But then you had the commons, and this is where the difference comes in. Voting took place in public, so men were chosen, and it's usually the landowning knights or the richest people in the town who were chosen to represent them in what's known as the House of Commons. So these people became known as your commons or your commoners. So now your parliament is made up of the king, your House of Lords, so your rich people, but then also commoner people. So for your last task, what I would like for you to do is use the textbook pages found on folder 113 to 114 to create a timeline of key dates in the development of Parliament. So I have given you 4 dates that need to be included on your timeline. For example, 1258 is the year that King Henry III had to sign the Provisions of Oxford. So tell me a little bit about what that was and when that happened. Same with what happened in 1264, 1265, and finally in August of 1265. So create a timeline in your book, on a loose leaf sheet of paper, on Word, the computer, however, but it needs to include those 4 dates and what happened in those dates. Then, using page 115 of the textbook pages, I want you to create a diagram in your book showing the setup of Parliament. Very similar to this image on this screen here. So you can draw simply a pyramid if you want to try and draw people, if you want to be creative. However, you need to have a visual of what this setup of Parliament is like. Finally, using page 114 in the textbook, I want you to answer this question. What is important about the Parliament created by Simon de Montfort in 1265? So think about when that first Parliament is sat. What makes it so important? Who is involved for the first time? And think about the significance of that first Parliament. Finally, if you would like to stretch and challenge yourself, you do have your hot and super hot challenge questions to be working on, okay? And as always, if you have any questions, please make sure that you email myself or Mr. Marshall and we will help to get you sorted, okay? Thank you for listening and good luck.